ulovligt. Nu går vi bag om tilrettelæggelsen af den kampagne, der endte med invasionen.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege of presenting to you the President of the United States.
I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
The United States went to war in Iraq because of a long-held neoconservative ambition to use regime change in Iraq, one of the biggest and wealthiest and most centrally located states in the Middle East, as a catalyst. The idea was that this would be the first domino that would fall. And because of its importance, it would lead to free enterprise and liberal democracy breaking out through the rest of the region.
We must prevent the terrorists and regimes who seek chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons from threatening the United States and the world.
The decision to go ahead and launch this war, which many neoconservatives had been anxious to do for some time, evidently was made not long after the 9/11 terrorist attack. Not because 9/11 had anything to do with Iraq, but because it so drastically and so suddenly changed the mood of the American people. It made them far more willing to take risks and bear costs in the name of national security. And one of the main ways in which the promoters of the war sold the idea publicly was to continually associate 9/11 and Iraq, not necessarily as a matter of any tight argument, but simply as a matter of rhetoric, constantly repeating those two things in the same sentence. Iraq, 9/11, Iraq, 9/11, again and again and again.
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade.
Da George W. Bush indsættes som præsident i januar 2001, står planerne om en krig mod Irak allerede højt på dagsordenen. Inderkredsen omkring præsidenten består af neokonservative politikere som vicepræsident Dick Cheney og forsvarsminister Donald Rumsfeld. De neokonservative har siden 1990'erne haft en vision om at skabe en ny og mere offensiv amerikansk udenrigspolitik, som skal eksportere demokrati og amerikanske værdier til Mellemøsten. Irak står øverst på listen, og USA støtter derfor aktivt et regimeskifte, der vil fjerne diktatoren Saddam Hussein. Terrorangrebet den 11. september 2001 bliver det vendepunkt for kampagnen, der kan sælge Irak-krigen til verdenssamfundet. Bush-administrationen lægger nu et massivt pres på landets efterretningstjenester, der skal indsamle informationer, der kæder Irak sammen med masseødelæggelsesvåben.
I was asked in February 2002 if I would come into the CIA headquarters to meet with all the people in our intelligence services who knew anything about uranium, knew anything about Iraq. The office of the vice president had asked a question on a piece of intelligence that they received. And the intelligence was of the existence of a memorandum of sale of 500 tons of uranium yellow cake from Niger to Iraq. It was an important question to ask simply because if Saddam had in fact been looking for uranium yellow cake in Niger, there would be only one reason, and it would be to create a nuclear weapons program. So I spent 8 days out there, and I talked to everybody that I could find who knew anything about it. This was a question of understanding whether or not one could actually execute on a bill of sale for 500 metric tons in a way that nobody would know about. Now, 500 metric tons represented as much as 40% increase of the annual production. You don't ramp up production 40% or 25% from 1 month to the next without all 5 consortium partners knowing about it. And the consortium partners included the French, the Austrians, the Japanese, and in essence, it just could not take place without everybody knowing. The report conveyed, I think, that there was no there, which should have been enough.
Joe Wilson afrapporterer til CIA, at det er højst usandsynligt, at Irak har købt uranmalm i Niger. CIA udfærdiger en rapport og sender den videre til vicepræsidentens kontor.
One of the central facts about intelligence work on Iraq that isn't really well understood publicly is how much influence on intelligence officers is exerted by the political environment who are already determined to launch this war and already decided what they wanted to do and already had decided what lines of argument they would use publicly to try to sell the war.
We were running up to this meeting between President and Prime Minister at the President's Ranch in Crawford, Texas. My role was to prepare the ground for this meeting. And we knew the Americans were pursuing regime change. We didn't know how they wanted to do it or when they wanted to do it, and they didn't know themselves. And we get there, and immediately Blair is whisked off to the ranch with President Bush, and nobody goes with them. Rice doesn't go, the Downing Street team don't go, I don't go. They are alone all Friday night until Saturday morning. Now, if you, in some ways, if you're an official, the most terrifying thing that can happen is that you lose your leader. And he's left alone with the US president. You think, without us being there to advise him, what the hell is he going to agree to? So Friday night, the two teams, me and the Downing Street team and the American team, we all go out to a Tex-Mex restaurant in Waco. So I remember saying to Manning and Powell, what have they decided? What have they done? And they said, we don't know. We've got to debrief the Prime Minister. We haven't had time yet. So nobody knew. Nobody knew. But then Blair gave a great speech at Texas A&M University on a Sunday morning. It was a very good speech. But one of the things he said that he'd never said before was he supported regime change.
If necessary, the action should be military. And again, if necessary and justified, it should involve regime change.
So suddenly, out of nowhere, comes regime change, which is not, until that moment, official British foreign policy. And it gives clues to what they must have talked about in private. In international law as interpreted by the British, we don't do regime change. Foreign Office lawyers are saying to us that's illegal. Saddam may be a bad man, but that's not good enough. You need a Security Council resolution to make that legitimate.
Tony Blair vender hjem til London. Han ved nu, at USA er fast besluttet på at bruge militærmagt til at fjerne Saddam Hussein.
The American relationship and our ability to partner America in these difficult issues is of fundamental importance, not just to this country, but to the wider world.
Blair argumenterer ligesom Bush for det moralsk rigtige i at fjerne diktatoren. Den irakiske befolkning fortjener sin frihed. Men Storbritannien kan ikke indlede en angrebskrig mod Irak uden et mandat fra FN's Sikkerhedsråd. Det fastslår Lord Goldsmith, som er landets øverste juridiske rådgiver.
I had this source, he rang me up and said, I need to meet. I said, where? And he said, where we met before, which was sort of like, so he's obviously thinking, I'm not going to say on the phone where we're going to meet. So I'm sort of security aware now about this. He's sort of, by his own approach, he's made me sort of think I've got to be careful. Then I went to this club. In London, there are these gentlemen's clubs, very posh and old-fashioned. He put these documents on the table.
De hemmelige dokumenter beskriver et møde mellem Tony Blair og hans ministre i Downing Street 9 måneder før krigen starter. Her diskuterer de, hvordan man kan legitimere en uundgåelig krig mod Irak.
The whole war campaign included selling the whole idea of going into battle to the public. And that's what was going on here with all these memos, and that was what they were talking about all the time. And the need to wrong foot Saddam Hussein. I mean, that phrase was actually used. We need to wrong foot Saddam Hussein, using the weapons inspectors. If we can get him to refuse the weapons inspectors, see something they need to see, then we've got the excuse to go to war.
Planen er at pålægge Saddam Hussein omfattende våbeninspektioner. Hvis Saddam ikke samarbejder, vil det automatisk medføre et mandat fra FN til at gå i krig. Tony Blair skal nu sælge ideen om nye FN-våbeninspektioner til Bush.
There is a very important private meeting at which Colin Powell meets the president. And I think Condoleezza Rice was there as well. And basically what Powell says is, look, if you want to do this thing, go to Iraq. Don't forget, if you smash it, you own it. We'd be crazy to go into Iraq without trying to get international support, which means going to the UN. And Bush buys the argument. Bush is not the crazed neocon he's sometimes accused of. The neocons were quite separate from Bush. Bush was not a Christian evangelical, and he was not a neocon. He was something else. And he actually announces that he's going to go to the UN and starts reaching out to European leaders.
I juli 2002 overtager Danmark formandskabet for EU. Og USA har brug for Danmarks støtte. Anders Fogh Rasmussen kan som EU-formand arbejde for en europæisk opbakning til en kommende krig mod Irak.
Vi har haft et fantastisk godt møde. Meget afslappet. Muntert under tiden også. Jeg har på min side understreget, at Danmark fra første færd har stået bag USA i kampen mod den internationale terrorisme. Præsidenten og jeg har opbygget et personligt venskab, som gør, at vi kan snakke meget direkte om international politik. Præsident Bush værdsætter loyalitet, og han betragter Danmark som en loyal og troværdig partner, og derfor så smitter det også af politisk, og giver derfor Danmark langt større indflydelse i Washington, end vores størrelse i sig selv berettiger til.
Danmark kan få en nøglerolle i forhold til at få Europa til at bakke op om en ny FN-resolution, der giver Saddam Hussein et sidste ultimatum.
Da vi har overtaget EU-formandskabet 1. juli, så skal jeg jo som formand for EU-udenrigsministrene hurtigst muligt afsted til Washington. Vi har det danske skoleskib liggende i havnen i Washington, og der modtager jeg Colin Powell. Og så går vi ned i kaptajnens kahyt, og det vil sige, at vi var meget få sammen, da det er en lille kahyt. Og det betyder så også, at fortroligheden bliver stærkere, fordi det bliver den jo, når man sidder 4 mennesker sammen. Så siger han, at vi skal ikke tage fejl af, at Bush ser meget alvorligt på Irak. Men han siger ikke, hvad Bush vil gøre ved Irak. Jeg havde jo kendskab til den her diskussion i USA omkring FN-sporet. Det var jo ikke nogen hemmelighed for os, der i hvert fald talte med amerikanerne. Så derfor var jeg også glad for at høre, at han sagde, at han ville arbejde gennem Sikkerhedsrådet. Og jeg synes også, det var relevant, han sagde, men det kan jo ikke bruges til noget FN, hvis det ender som et folkeforbund, altså tandløst.
Blair is very, very anxious that Bush will ignore the UN. So the Blair mission is to find out what it is that Bush intends and to influence Bush to do what we want him to do.
It's my honor to welcome the Prime Minister back to Camp David. I look forward to spending a good 3 hours talking to our friend about how to keep the peace. And we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about how to promote freedom around the world.
The deal is Blair gets going through the UN, although we don't know what it means. And Bush gets another statement of support.
Right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I've had several hours of talks with the President, and the talks were excellent, as you would expect. And I think the key thing really to say to you is that we have a shared analysis, a shared determination to deal with the issue of weapons of mass destruction.
Then they all go home, and we have about a week before the UN meeting where the President will speak. And there is a huge battle inside Washington. The State Department was saying to Bush, we need you to say that we must work for a resolution, a final warning to Saddam. Meantime, the Cheney people say, Saddam has jerked the UN around for a decade. The last thing we need is going to the UN. So Cheney was really pushing back. And then on the eve of Bush's speech to the United Nations, I rang up some people and they said, we're on draft number 22 or whatever it was. I mean, we have no idea which way this speech is going to go.
The conduct of the Iraqi regime is a threat to the authority of the United Nations and a threat to peace. All the world now faces a test. Are Security Council resolutions to be honored and enforced or cast aside without consequence? Will the United Nations serve the purpose of its founding, or will it be irrelevant?
And then on his teleprompter, apparently, the paragraph which referred to support for a resolution, working for a resolution, wasn't on the teleprompter text. Now, conspiracy or mistake. But Bush could remember that there was something missing.
My nation will work with the UN Security Council to meet our common challenge.
And to the astonishment of all of us, he talks about working for resolutions in the plural, which was probably a mistake.
We will work with the UN Security Council for the necessary resolutions. But the purposes of the United States should not be doubted.
But the key thing was, it was American policy now to work for a resolution which would give Saddam Hussein one last chance. And we were cheering in London because we saw this as the means to create an international coalition. Satisfy the legalities, heaven, diplomatic heaven.
what intelligence officers like myself were witnessing as far as the campaign for selling the war was mostly the same thing that the American people as a whole were hearing. The public speeches, the statements. Mr. Cheney, the vice president, kicked off the main part of the campaign with a major speech in which he made some very definite statements about the unconventional weapons programs of the Iraqis.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
That wasn't coming from the intelligence community, and the analysts in the intelligence agency who were working the problem of Iraqi weapons program were hearing that stuff for the first time, the same as the people in the audience were hearing it when the vice president delivered his speech.
He now is trying, through his illicit procurement network, to acquire the equipment he needs to be able to enrich uranium.
Aluminum tubes.
Specifically aluminum tubes. There's a story in the New York Times this morning.
There was a famous story that was written on the front page of the New York Times, just as the White House was rolling out its marketing campaign to sell the war, that said that U.S. intelligence officials had acquired important new evidence showing that Iraq was aggressively restarting its nuclear program because they had identified aluminum tubes that the Iraqis were purchasing that could only be used as centrifuges for a nuclear weapons program. Once you get the front page story in the New York Times, once you get that imagery of the mushroom cloud, and then, by the way, I should add that the day that that story appeared, Vice President Cheney was on Meet the Press, one of the top interview shows in American television, and is asked about this claim about aluminum tubes, and it says, of course, I can't discuss classified intelligence, but you might want to take a look at the front page of the New York Times today. They're reporting something. And of course, that was a story which the administration had leaked to the New York Times so that they could promote these claims. It was a very skillful manipulation of the American press, and unfortunately, the country's leading newspaper went along.
I september går Blair i offensiven med en rapport fra det britiske efterretningsvæsen. Rapporten fremlægger nye beviser for, at Saddam Hussein har et aktivt program for masseødelæggelsesvåben, og at Irak har forsøgt at købe uran i Afrika.
The day began with the 50-page dossier being released in Whitehall. It says he's still making chemical and biological weapons, which his troops can deploy at just 45 minutes' notice, and that he's sought to acquire significant quantities of uranium for nuclear weapons. Iraqi officials are said to have been on shopping trips to Africa. No countries are named, but Niger, Gabon, Namibia and South Africa all produce the radioactive metal.
Forsvarets efterretningstjeneste fik 2 britiske rapporter, en uklassificeret og en hemmelig klassificeret. Og så skulle vi skrive en ny trusselsvurdering. Der har ikke været skrevet trusselsvurderinger på Irak i pæn tid forinden. Den ene af de britiske rapporter indeholdt et varsel på 45 minutter for indsættelse af biologiske og kemiske våben. Almindelig sund fornuft sagde, at det kunne ikke passe. Og en ting, der yderligere var meget kritisabel ved den måde, det stod på, det var selvfølgelig, at der var ingen nærmere beskrivelse af, hvad de 45 minutter gik på. Om det var fra Saddam gav ordren, eller om det var den tid, det tog at få flyene i luften, eller hvad det var. Der var intet, der beskrev det nærmere.
One of the unfortunate things for a small state who became part of the coalition of the willing is that because they don't have their own independent sources of information as much as a major power like the United States does, they are, in a sense, dealing at the same level as the public is. But here in the United States, for the U.S. Congress as well as for the public, the issue got dumbed down to one of he's got them or he doesn't have them. And I'm afraid smaller countries like Denmark were just kind of taken along for the ride.
Det er for sent, når først giftgassen er spredt over en af vores store byer.
The intelligence picture they paint concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes, and that he is actively trying to acquire nuclear weapons capability.
According to the British government, Iraqi regime could launch a biological or chemical attack in as little as 45 minutes after the order were given.
All of these various papers and estimates that were done back in 2002 were part of a campaign both to influence the thinking of the American public and, very closely related to that, the thinking of members of Congress who did vote to authorize the use of military force in Iraq in the fall of 2002, a vote that passed.
We had a matrix, and that matrix had all the things we'd need across the top: political support, troops, overflight rights. For example, Denmark, it was probably political support, maybe a few troops. You go out and find as many allies and friends as you can to help you in whatever way they will offer to help you and you need, and you sign them up. And then you meet with them later and you say thank you.
Europa og USA må trække på samme hammel i bestræbelserne på at forhindre, at tyranniske og uansvarlige regimer kommer til at råde over masseødelæggelsesvåben. Saddam Hussein har i årevis siddet FN's bindende påbud overhørig om at skille sig af med sådanne forfærdelige våben. Det internationale samfunds bestræbelser på at håndhæve disse påbud gennem Sikkerhedsrådet har Danmarks og EU's fulde støtte. FN bør nu leve op til sit ansvar.
I FN's hovedkvarter i New York har Sikkerhedsrådet indledt forhandlinger om den nye resolution, der skal afvæbne Irak. I det første udkast kræver Colin Powell, at Sikkerhedsrådet automatisk skal give mandat til krig, hvis Saddam ikke samarbejder med FN's våbeninspektører. Kina, Rusland og Frankrig synes udspillet er for hårdt. Den franske udenrigsminister Dominique de Villepin er fortaler for en resolution, der ikke automatisk giver mandat til krig. Det danske formandskab kommer på hårdt arbejde for at fastholde enighed blandt EU-landene. Især England og Frankrig er uenige.
As presidency of the European Union, Denmark will strive to build a common position of the Union. If Iraq's defiance continues, the Security Council must face its responsibilities.
Efter 7 ugers forhandlinger vedtager Sikkerhedsrådet enstemmigt resolution 1441, der skal afvæbne Irak. Resolutionen kræver, at Saddam lukker FN's våbeninspektører ind i Irak. Hvis han ikke samarbejder, skal Sikkerhedsrådet revurdere situationen og vedtage en ny resolution, før det kan udløse mandat til krig.
And the most important thing that it does is it demands of Saddam that he prove his innocence. You're already guilty, and you've got to do this, and you've got to do that, and prove to us that you can be a good international citizen. I'm paraphrasing now.
Den 18. november 2002 vender våbeninspektørerne tilbage til Irak. De ledes af den svenske diplomat og jurist Hans Blix. Ifølge resolutionen skal Irak samarbejde betingelsesløst med FN.
He was going to check on Iraqi holdings of weapons of mass destruction. He had just started. And you knew that he couldn't come up with any definitive conclusions for 6 months minimum. Meantime, the American war machine was ready to go in January. How in God's name were you going to try to synchronize what Blix was doing over here with what the Anglo-American, Australian, and whoever else was their war machine, it was already assembling down in the Gulf?
Maybe they hoped that the Iraqis would reject the resolution 4041, or else that the Iraqis would do as they did in the 90s, to deny access to inspectors. And again, they could go to the council and hopefully get an authorization. But the fact was that the Iraqis accepted the resolution with some way or other. They didn't reject it, and that they did not deny access.
If there is a breach of the existing UN resolution, I have no doubt at all that the right thing to do in those circumstances is to disarm Saddam by force.
we, the Brits and the Americans, had to try and find this thing called the smoking gun, which would then short-circuit the diplomatic Blix process and enable us to say to the world, yep, we've caught Saddam red-handed.
Let there be no misunderstanding. If Saddam Hussein does not fully disarm, for the safety of our people and for the peace of the world, we will lead a coalition to disarm him. And if war is forced upon us, we will fight with the full force and might of the United States military, and we will prevail. The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. From Africa, he said. The African country to which the president had been referring in the State of the Union address was Niger. That really ran counter to what I and others had concluded. They had essentially lied to us.
The president quoted a British paper. We did not know at the time. No one knew at the time in our circles. Maybe someone knew down in the bowels of the agency, but no one in our circles knew that there were doubts and suspicions that this might be a forgery.
That's when it became apparent to me that the U.S. government was not going to come clean. They were not going to tell the truth on this matter unless I forced their hand myself. And I knew that the New York Times was interested in my telling the story. If I would tell the story in my own voice, my own words, and put my name to it, it would have much more impact. It was entitled What I Did Not Find in Africa, and it said basically that the administration had skewed the intelligence and that we deserved to know whether we had gone to war under false pretenses.
Colin Powell was sent up to New York in early February to make the case for Saddam still having weapons of mass destruction. It was quite persuasive at the time, but has since turned out to be largely illusory.
Powell comes into my office and he throws a sheaf of papers down on my desk. It's a 48-page description of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction programs. And he says, this is my script for my presentation at the United Nations on the 5th of February. We had something like 6 days and nights to get this monumental presentation ready and to convince, not the UN Security Council, that was one audience, but it wasn't the most important one. The American people, of course, were the first and most important audience, and the international community was the second. I think all told in those 6-7 days, I probably slept 6 hours, as did most of the members of my team.
Well, it was a day of enormous drama at the UN. The very fact that Colin Powell and the Bush administration decided to come to the UN and present their evidence had been hugely anticipated. They had tried in other ways to convince both their allies and the Secretary General privately of the nature of their evidence, how compelling it was, and how much it demonstrated Saddam's non-compliance, but it had failed. It was a period where the United States seemed to listen less and less to the rest of the world. And so Kofi Annan played very much a role where member states and leaders would come to him and say to him what they really feared saying directly to the administration in Washington and hoped he would convey on their behalf. The war and the run-up to the war became less and less about Iraq and more for a lot of countries about the United States and its role in the world.
The purpose of this meeting is to hear a presentation by the United States. I call now on the distinguished Secretary of State, His Excellency, Mr. Colin Powell.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The Secretary told the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, I must have materials intelligence, signals intelligence, human intelligence that is independent of the other source, and I must have at minimum 3 of them for everything. And Tenet agreed to that. Of course, he violated that entirely, we later learned. We relocated totally to Langley, and we stayed there for 5, 6 days and nights. I had to translate Arabic, Farsi. I had to get it on tape. I had to pick the satellite photography that was going into the presentation. I had to get clearances for that. We were trying to convict Iraq as if we were in a court of law. And we had all this circumstantial evidence, none of it a smoking gun, none of it really telltale, but all of it in its entirety, a mass of circumstantial evidence that would be so overwhelming, presented by the only member of the administration who had real bona fides with the international community, with the UN Security Council, and with the American people, and so it would be convincing.
Last November 8th, this council passed Resolution 1441 by a unanimous vote. The purpose of that resolution was to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
George Tenet had discovered that at one point in our preparations, Secretary Powell had come up to me. He was angry. And he had put me in a room alone with him, closed the door, and said how uncomfortable he was with talking about Al-Qaeda Baghdad contacts and in talking about an active nuclear program. So I said, fine, let's throw it out. And we agreed to throw both of those things out. Well, those were huge items to throw out of the presentation. Active nuclear program and contacts with Al-Qaeda. George Tenet, within 30 minutes, takes care of both of them. He comes in breathless and tells us about an interrogation that has just taken place of a high-level Al-Qaeda operative that not only reveals substantial contacts, but reveals that the Mukhabarat in Iraq was actually training Al-Qaeda in how to use chemical and biological weapons. Whoa, that was devastating. That's all George said. We put it back in.
Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants.
Later, we discover that was Sheikh al-Libi. He was interrogated in Egypt with no U.S. personnel present. He was waterboarded. And he even said afterwards that he said what he said to get the waterboarding to stop. The most powerful things to me were the NSA intercepts. I mean, I'd been to the NSA. I knew their capabilities. So I'm listening to all these intercepts, and they're in Arabic or Farsi. I'm listening to it, and I'm actually trying to figure out how I'm going to technically use these things.
Just a few weeks ago, we intercepted communications between 2 commanders in Iraq's 2nd Republican Guard Corps. Listen.
Hello. 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 Ibrahim شلونك؟ الله يسلمك سيدي. شلون صرت؟ الله يحفظك. شلون صرت؟ خير الحمد لله سيدي. نقي إبراهيم. نعم سيدي. الحين اكتب يمك. أي طيب.
So I'm listening to it and I'm saying, this could all be just the opposite of what it's supposed to be. This guy could be saying, get rid of that piece of equipment because it violates sanctions.
إبراهيم. نعم سيدي. نقي إبراهيم. وياك سيدي. رفع. عبارة. عوامل الأعصاب. عوامل الأعصاب.
This guy could be saying, take nerve agent out of your communications instructions because we don't have any nerve agents anymore. So I'm listening to it and I'm saying, all of that's circumstantial and all of it is interpretable from the other side, as well as from this, you know, the negative side that he's got these things. And it was troubling even at that moment when I realized that. What I thought was the most powerful part of the presentation had a double meaning, maybe.
The Security Council has a horseshoe table, and he sat at one end of it, and I sat at the other side, so I could see him straight across the room. And I guess I kept a fairly poker face, not showing any reactions, because there were 1,000 cameras in the room, and one had to be fairly straight-faced. But I felt very skeptical about many things he said.
I believe that Iraq is now in further material breach of its obligations. Iraq has now placed itself in danger of the serious consequences called for in UN Resolution 1441. How much longer are we willing to put up with Iraq's non-compliance before we, as a council, we as the United Nations say, enough, enough.
The UN Security Council was the first time I saw the whole thing without any interruptions and distractions. I have to be honest with you and tell you that my first reaction was a great sigh of relief. The very fact that we had done it to the point where there was a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you could perceive those things, gave me such a sigh of relief, because technically, mechanically, I thought I had an impossible task. I had to get out of there. I just had to get out of there. I cannot escape the conclusion that there had to be some lying going on. I think that the groupthink was such that it didn't matter, because when we get to Iraq, he had them before, he'll have them then. And when we get to Iraq, we're going to find something. And so it doesn't matter what the details are now. Let's just get it out there. Let's convince people. Let's go there, because they're going to find something. And the shock in everyone's face when they didn't find anything. And I must say, guilt here too, because I helped put it together unwittingly.
Looking at Saddam in Iraq from Washington, you know, this is Americans' assumption. It's always about us. Well, yes, Saddam did think about Washington. That was important. But he worried a lot more about Tehran much of the time. And many of his ambiguous statements about WMD, many of his incentives for doing things, were more keyed on Iran than towards the West. This was an insight that, you know, was not prominent in Washington.
It became obvious in what danger Iraq was and where the U.S. seemed to be heading, that they were serious. It was not a paper tiger that was lying around. The U.S. began to build up the troops already in the summer of 2002. And I think it's very likely Iraqis would not have accepted inspection had it not been for the U.S. build-up. And then as they saw this gradually building up more and more, and I think they got really scared, proactive, almost frantic, I would say, in February 2003.
Den 7. marts 2003 præsenterer Hans Blix resultatet af 3 måneders inspektioner i Irak. Våbeninspektørerne har besøgt mere end 600 irakiske lokaliteter.
The numerous initiatives which are now taken by the Iraqi side can be seen as active or even proactive. I reported to the council precisely the increased kind of cooperation that we had received, and the tone was a different one in February, and end of February and beginning of March. When the tone changed, it was because the reality changed.
There is no indication that Iraq has attempted to import aluminum tubes for use in centrifuge enrichment. After 3 months of intrusive inspections, we have to date found no evidence or plausible indication of the revival of a nuclear weapon program in Iraq.
Even with a proactive Iraqi attitude induced by continued outside pressure, it will still take some time to verify sites and items. It will not take years, nor weeks, but months. In the past 2 months, during which we have built up our presence in Iraq, we have conducted about 300 inspections, saying that there are no prescribed items, and if no evidence is presented to the contrary.
There's just the inexorable flow to war. The most inexorable part is the deployment of military forces, because when you deploy them, you better use them. Are you going to bring them home once you've got them in Kuwait and at ship and flowing them from the north and flowing them from the south? And no. So you set that inexorable mechanism in motion. Doesn't matter whether you made a decision or not, and you go to war.
I think already from 2002, they had an invasion default mode. they don't really care about inspections. We knew what the attitude of the Vice President of the US was. But I think that if we had gone on with our inspections a couple of months, and we had gone to all the sites given to us by intelligence and found no weapons, because there weren't any weapons of mass destruction, I think it would have been much more difficult for the US to go on with the plans for invasion. So a few months more, yes, that could have made a difference.
I look back on it and I wish ardently that I had gone ahead with my deepest feelings and just left. It wouldn't have changed anything, but it sure would have made my life easier. I don't think it would have changed anything if Powell had left. They would have just found somebody else. Condi was ready to take over.
Bush did help Blair try and get the second resolution. He did make the last effort. And this led to Blair in a futile search with the Americans for at least a majority of the Security Council to back a second resolution favoring war.
Mens forhandlingerne i Sikkerhedsrådet er i fuld gang, bringer den britiske avis The Observer en afsløring. En britisk efterretningsanalytiker har lækket en mail, der afslører, at Storbritannien og USA aflytter diplomater i Sikkerhedsrådet.
There's an email from NSA, National Security Agency, which is the US counterpart to GCHQ. And as I read it, I was more and more amazed at what I was reading. It was a very specific request to the British intelligence services to eavesdrop, intercept communications of the 6 swing nations that were sitting on the Security Council at the time, and gather any information that we could on these diplomats that would allow the US to either blackmail or bribe them or somehow play some kind of a dirty tricks on them so that they would vote yes, which would authorize the invasion of Iraq. I just felt increasingly angry, and I felt that that was an explosive email that had the potential to derail the whole bandwagon that was charging ahead. And I felt it needed to get out into the public domain as quickly as possible because time was of the essence.
Afsløringen svækker både Storbritanniens og USA's troværdighed i rådet.
The members of the Security Council now face a grim choice. If they fail to agree on a common position and action is taken without the authority of the Security Council, the legitimacy and support for any such action will be seriously impaired.
Blair øger sit pres på Sikkerhedsrådet. Han fremlægger et udkast til en ny resolution, som skal fastslå, at Saddam Hussein har forspildt sin chance, og at det betyder krig. Men et overvældende flertal i Sikkerhedsrådet mener stadig, at konflikten kan løses diplomatisk. Saddam samarbejder, og våbeninspektørerne bør have mere tid.
When you have active cooperation on the part of Iraq, as the inspector said, you don't talk about days. Mr. Blick said, not a year, not years, not weeks, but months.
Da planen om at legitimere krigen gennem FN møder modstand, vælger Bush at handle på egen hånd. Han insisterer på, at Saddam allerede har forbrudt sig imod tidligere FN-resolutioner. Tony Blair og Anders Fogh Rasmussen bakker præsidenten op, men de mangler at få opbakning fra deres respektive parlamenter.
Nu må Danmark være klar over, at der ikke er en ny beslutning fra FN. Vi har aldrig forlangt den. Så må vi med Folketingets partier drøfte i morgen, hvad er så konsekvensen i forhold til Danmark.
Jeg skal så her for en god ordens skyld gøre opmærksom på, hvad det drejer sig om. VX nervegas og sinepsgas inden for det kemiske område.
Når man sammenholder, hvad han siger, da han læser op af papirerne, med hvad der rent faktisk står i papirerne, så kan man se, at han læser ikke hele den del af det her afsnit om Iraks masseødelæggelsesvåben. Den del, der handler om atomvåben, springer han bare over og så læser videre.
Det er altså ikke noget, man kan tale sig fra. Det er noget, man er nødt til at reagere på. Dette er problemet.
Det papir er et håndakt, som er skrevet af embedsmænd i Udenrigsministeriet, og det baserer sig blandt andet på FN's inspektioner og på det internationale atomenergiagentur IAEA. Og det, der står i det afsnit, det er, at Irak har ikke noget atomprogram. Der er ikke noget atomvåbenprogram, og der er ikke noget atomprogram. Og det er ikke blevet genoptaget, siden det blev nedlagt i forbindelse med den første Golfkrig. Det vil sige, at der er ikke nogen form for beviser for, at Irak skulle have et atomvåbenprogram. Det er fuldstændig faret af banen. Det papir, det står Per Stig Møller med på Folketingets talerstol og holder den oplysning tilbage.
Det egentlige er jo de ting, jeg nævnte. Det er jo det egentlige.
Så går der et kvarter, og så står statsminister Anders Fogh Rasmussen over i statsministeriet og holder pressemøde om den her beslutning om at gå i krig. Og der siger han, dertil kommer risikoen for, at Irak snart har atomvåben.
Og dertil kommer risikoen for, at han snart vil råde over atomvåben.
Altså, det er jo notorisk ikke sandt.
Hvis man altid vil være 100% sikker på, at beviserne er i orden, så kan man jo altså risikere, at terroristerne de slår først. Og der synes jeg, at vi har en legitim ret til at forebygge terrorisme ved at være dem, der selv slår først.
USA og Storbritannien begrunder deres invasion med, at Irak skal afvæbnes for masseødelæggelsesvåben. I Danmark bliver hovedargumentet for krigen, at Saddam ikke samarbejder med FN's våbeninspektører.
61 stemte for, 50 imod. Forslaget er vedtaget.
Danmarks deltagelse i krigen bliver vedtaget, på trods af at et flertal i FN's Sikkerhedsråd vurderer, at Irak faktisk samarbejder med våbeninspektørerne.
Vi har valgt at følge USA og Storbritannien, fordi de har besluttet at gøre det rigtige og det nødvendige.
Huge protests. One of Blair's finest oratorical performances was in the House of Commons to persuade the majority of MPs to accept the argument, but he did exaggerate the significance of the intelligence.
I London har den juridiske rådgiver Lord Goldsmith ændret holdningen til krigens legalitet. Storbritannien vælger at følge USA, og Goldsmith vurderer nu, at krigen ikke kræver et nyt FN-mandat. Blair vinder afstemningen i det britiske parlament og får grønt lys til at følge USA i krig.
The United Nations Security Council has not lived up to its responsibilities, so we will rise to ours. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing. For their own safety, all foreign nationals, including journalists and inspectors, should leave Iraq immediately.
Truth is the first casualty in war. Well, truth had been a casualty all through. I remember that when the US went in, Colin Powell, I think, said that this is the moment of truth. Well, it was the moment of truth, but not the truth that the US government had held.
He did not have stocks of weapons of mass destruction. He did not have chemical or biological weapons. He did not have an active nuclear program. And that's what, you know, the average American, the average world citizen thought they would find, and it wasn't there. And so what was seen as the premise for the war vanished.
Der var ikke noget mandat fra Sikkerhedsrådet. Der var ikke noget spørgsmål om retten til selvforsvar. Der var ikke noget spørgsmål om en ret til at foretage en humanitær intervention. Der var ikke noget lovligt, folkeretligt grundlag for at iværksætte den aktion.
USA og Storbritannien må erkende, at de har ført en krig på et forkert grundlag. George W. Bush og Tony Blairs politiske eftermæle vil for altid være mærket af den krig, de indledte. En krig, som af FN blev erklæret for ulovlig.
I regret deeply and profoundly the loss of life, whether from our own armed forces, those of other nations, the civilians who help people in Iraq, or the Iraqis themselves. And
quiet, please. He said the only way you can influence Americans is by being close to them. But he got so close that the leverage he might have had, he lost. The international coalition collapsed. We did not exhaust UN processes because we didn't put these things down as iron conditions. Blair never said, I can't do it if you don't do these things. He never said that. In the end, what he said was, whatever you decide to do, George, I'm with you.
Det handler overhovedet ikke om masseødelæggelsesvåben, men om alt muligt andet. Navnlig, at Saddam Hussein ikke ville samarbejde med FN's Sikkerhedsråd. Og det var det, som var grunden til, at den danske regering traf beslutning om at deltage i krigen.
Altså, det står ikke i noget ordentligt forhold til hinanden. Misligholdelsen i form af manglende samarbejde, og så den meget kraftige reaktion. Og navnlig ikke, når det så efterfølgende viser sig, at Saddam der i foråret 2003 faktisk var begyndt, i hvert fald i et vist omfang, at samarbejde med våbeninspektørerne.
Efterfølgende er der jo kommet mange oplysninger på bordet. Det understreger da kun, at det var meget klogt, at den danske regering brugte en anden begrundelse.
I Danmark får kritikken af Irak-krigen ikke nær de samme konsekvenser som i USA og England. Anders Fogh Rasmussen forlader i 2009 posten som statsminister for at tiltræde en ny stilling som generalsekretær for NATO.
We had it wrong. The intelligence community had it wrong. Politicians had it wrong. And Saddam Hussein had it wrong. You know, his judgments about Washington were wrong. Everyone involved in this had a misconception and a misperception. Cases like this, and I would look at Iran this way, or North Korea. We really don't understand what's going on in those capitals. We don't really understand how they are making decisions. And they really don't have a clue what Washington's doing. And yet, are we really compelled to make critical decisions based on that level of ignorance?
Det er ikke kun Dokumania, der har sat fokus på 10-året for Irak-krigen. P1 har lavet en serie om arven efter Irak-krigen. En krig, der handlede om masseødelæggelsesvåben, der ikke var der, om olie og en diktator. Men selvom meget er ændret, er der endnu ikke fred. I stedet er der udsigt til en borgerkrig. Du kan høre serien ved at gå ind på dr.dk/arven efter Irak-krigen. Og senere i aften har vi BBC-dokumentar om de historier, som verdens civilbefolkning ikke fik om krigen. Der er ærlige udlægninger fra amerikanske generaler, lokale oprørere samt engelske og britiske soldater. Det hemmelige Irak i aften kl. 23:10. Om lidt er vi klar med en helt anden dokumentar. Om en gruppe tilbagetrukne munke, der lige pludselig røg til tops på de engelske hitlister med deres CD-udgivelse. For 10 år siden skulle den allierede hær skaffe irakerne fred og et bedre liv.
The actual reality of that is we made it worse.
We changed the word liberation to occupation.
فما لها شغلة بصدام حسين أبدا ولا لها علاقة به.
Det hemmelige Irak i aften 23:10. Senere i aften fortæller René sin livshistorie, der på overfladen var fuld af succes, men i virkeligheden var præget af morens depressioner og selvmordstrusler. Erkendelsens time kl. 22.
Jeg er et vanemenneske, og jeg ser ikke tv om morgenen. Jeg savner noget substans. Der mangler simpelthen et godt morgenprogram, der kommer i dybden med dagens historier. Men det laver vi om på nu. DR2 Morgen er 3 timer med nyheder og baggrund.
Vi kigger på de historier, der vil komme til at dominere dagen, og taler med de mennesker, der sætter dagsordenen.
DR2 Morgen med Niels Krause-Kjær og Anja Bo. Alle hverdage fra 6:30.
De står op 4:30 hver morgen. De tilbringer mere end 4 timer om dagen med at bede. De har viet deres liv til Gud. Og så er de musikstjerner. Her er historien om munke på top 10.
Nostre salute